Across the quiet hills of Fairhaven, where the leaves whispered secrets to the breeze and the hospital sat like a lone guardian over the sleepy town, something extraordinary stirred beneath the ordinary. Inside, room 214 of St. Alora's Medical Center, Officer Kyle Bennett lay recovering from wounds far deeper than flesh. His spine fractured, his spirit shaken after a brutal takedown of a drug ring gone wrong. But no one, not the nurses, not even the doctors, knew that danger hadn't truly passed, until a golden retriever named Sunny walked through the ICU doors and wouldn't stop barking. Before we begin, do you have a dog of your own? Drop your answer in the comments. I'd love to know who's watching alongside their furry best friend. And if you believe that every animal deserves a loving home, not loneliness, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might just change how you see loyalty and how one bark can save a life. Fairhaven, nestled between pine-covered hills and the soft hush of the Columbia River, was the kind of small Oregon town where life moved slow, and the rain came often more like a steady sigh than a storm. That morning, as mist clung lazily to the hospital windows and the roads shimmered under a quiet drizzle, the town carried on unaware that something extraordinary was about to unfold within the pale blue walls of St. Alora's Medical Center. Inside room 214, Officer Kyle Bennett lay still beneath stiff hospital sheets, his face pale against the pillow, his frame too lean for a 28-year-old once known for chasing down suspects through alleyways without breaking a sweat. Kyle had the rugged good looks of someone raised outdoors, sun-creased cheekbones, short dark hair always slightly disheveled, and the kind of jawline that used to carry a confident smirk. But that smirk had been absent for weeks now. Since the botched drug raid in Portland, his spine had been fractured in 2 places, and his legs remained stubbornly unresponsive. Physical pain was one thing, the silence from his lower body, that was another beast. He stared at the ceiling, mind adrift, until a soft knock interrupted the hum of machines. The door opened, and in stepped head nurse Hannah Collins, clipboard in hand, her hazel eyes already scanning vitals. Hannah was in her early 50s, tall with an upright posture that disguised the exhaustion behind her kind face. Her graying auburn hair was always pulled into a tight bun, a practical style she'd kept since her days in emergency trauma. Known for her warmth and worry in equal measure, Hannah had a habit of wringing her hands when anxious, something she'd done a lot since Kyle was admitted. Years ago, she'd lost her husband to an unexpected stroke in this very hospital, and since then, she never let a patient fade without a fight. Maybe that's why she checked in on Kyle more often than required. "You slept at all?" she asked gently, setting the clipboard aside. Kyle gave a dry chuckle. "Close my eyes, not sure it counts." She nodded, then glanced toward the hallway. "Well, I think you're about to meet someone who might help." Moments later, the sound of paws on linoleum echoed closer, soft but purposeful. A golden blur trotted into the room, tail swaying like a pendulum of peace. His name was Sunny, a 6-year-old golden retriever with a cream-colored coat that shimmered like sunlight through honey. His eyes, warm and searching, carried an almost human empathy. He was part of the Healing Tales Initiative, a volunteer program where therapy dogs visited recovering patients. But Sunny was no ordinary therapy dog. Trained beyond basic emotional support, he'd once calmed a war veteran mid-nightmare, halted a panic attack with a gentle nudge, and stood by a grieving widow through the funeral of her child. His gift wasn't just comfort, it was awareness, unspoken, instinctual, and precise. Sunny's handler, Jacob Rivers, followed in behind a retired K-9 unit handler in his early 60s, weathered by decades on the force but with eyes still sharp under his worn baseball cap. He wore a beige tactical vest over a flannel shirt, and his left hand held Sunny's leash loosely, with the kind of ease that comes only after years of trust between man and dog. "This is Sunny," Jacob said simply, as the dog padded softly up to Kyle's bed. Kyle raised an eyebrow, surprised when the golden rested his head on the edge of the mattress. No barking, no excessive tail wagging, just presence, stillness, connection. Kyle's hand moved hesitantly toward the dog's head. Sunny didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned in. A small smile, tentative and crooked, tugged at the corner of Kyle's lips for the first time in days. "You've got good taste and patience," he murmured. Jacob smiled behind his beard. "He usually does." Across the corridor, Nurse Hannah ducked into another room, room 210, where a PTSD patient named Leo Farnsworth had just begun hyperventilating. Leo, a former firefighter in his early 40s, had served 2 tours in Iraq before returning home and losing his wife to cancer. His PTSD episodes came suddenly, triggered by sounds, smells, or even silence. Hannah had dealt with him many times, but today his panic was spiking hard and fast. "Jacob," she called softly. "We might need Sonny." Jacob looked at Kyle apologetically, gave a quick nod, and clicked his tongue. Sonny lifted his head reluctantly, but obeyed. As soon as the Golden stepped into Leo's room, something shifted. He didn't bark or jump. He simply walked over, sat beside Leo's wheelchair, and rested his paw gently on the man's leg. Leo, mid-shaking breath, looked down eyes wide, and suddenly exhaled. Deep, grounding. Sonny had done it again. Kyle watched from across the hall, eyes narrowing in curiosity. "That dog's more doctor than half this hospital," he muttered to himself, then winced as a sharp ache pulsed through his back. Later that afternoon, Hannah returned to Kyle's room as the rain intensified outside, smudging the town's silhouette beyond the window. "We'll schedule another scan tomorrow," she said, "and I'll try to get Sonny back in for a longer visit. I think he liked you." Kyle gave a slow nod. "Yeah, and I think he knew I needed him before I even knew it myself." Outside, the drizzle turned golden in the late afternoon light, and for the first time since the raid, Kyle fell asleep without medication, his dreams filled not with gunshots or concrete, but with warm fur and silent understanding. Rain still hung in the sky like a curtain of whispers as morning crept into Fairhaven. St. Alora's Medical Center stirred to life slowly, nurses making quiet rounds and machines humming their metallic lullabies. In room 214, Kyle Bennett blinked awake to the soft shuffle of footsteps and the scent of warm oatmeal drifting from the hallway. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he'd truly slept or merely floated in and out of memory, but one thing stood out from his dreams: barking. Loud, sharp, echoing like a flare in a dark forest. He rubbed his eyes and looked around. No Sonny this morning. No golden tail or gentle eyes. Just the faint trace of dog hair clinging to the edge of his blanket, like proof he hadn't imagined yesterday. Kyle stretched his fingers toward the bedside remote and raised the head of his bed, wincing slightly. He was greeted a few minutes later by Hannah Collins, who entered with her usual blend of calm and worry. She wore a navy blue sweater under her scrubs, her auburn hair neatly pinned, and her reading glasses perched low on her nose. She carried a tray with scrambled eggs, toast, and the obligatory banana. "Morning," she said with a soft smile. "I thought you might eat better if someone delivered with a personal touch." Kyle offered a faint grin. "That personal touch includes watching me choke on this hospital toast? Hey, I smuggled in real butter. You're welcome." She sat the tray down and checked the IV drip beside his bed. Her fingers were practiced but gentle, a habit born from years of refusing to let patients feel like mere cases. "Did Sonny come in today?" Kyle asked as she jotted down his vitals. She paused for half a beat. "He's scheduled for the afternoon. Jacob's bringing him in after lunch. He's been visiting the pediatric wing this morning." She turned to him, eyes warm. "He really did something yesterday, didn't he?" Kyle nodded slowly. "He knew I needed something, even before I did." In the hallway outside, the morning continued in its rhythm. Nurses, orderlies, and tech staff moving through fluorescent corridors. Among them was Mitch Rourke, one of the hospital's technical maintenance staff. In his early 40s, Mitch was tall but stooped, with a wiry frame, salt and pepper stubble, and a permanent scowl that made it hard to guess what he was thinking. He had dark eyes, quick hands, and a way of blending into the background that made him nearly invisible. Most people simply knew him as the fix-it guy. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his voice was quiet and clipped. Some found him efficient, others found him unsettling. Mitch rolled his toolkit toward the ICU's central monitoring panel. Something had caused the oxygen readout to flicker the night before, and he was here to recalibrate it. He didn't look up as he passed room 214 until a sharp, sudden bark pierced the hallway. Sonny was back. Jacob, walking a few paces behind the golden retriever, stiffened as the dog abruptly stopped in front of Mitch and let out another bark louder this time, tail raised, ears forward, and body tense. The hallway stilled instantly. A nurse turning a corner froze, her coffee nearly spilling. A doctor paused mid-sentence. Sonny's bark wasn't playful. It wasn't uncertain. It was warning. Mitch stepped back half a step, startled. "Hey, what the hell?" he muttered, adjusting the strap of his tool belt. But Sonny didn't back down. His paws spread slightly, stance firm. A growl vibrated low in his chest. Jacob tugged the leash. "Sonny, heel." But the dog didn't budge. Kyle, hearing the commotion from his room, shifted painfully in bed and peered through the doorway. He saw the golden form bristling, eyes locked on the technician with a kind of fierce certainty. Jacob knelt beside Sonny, placing a hand on the dog's shoulder. "Easy, boy," he murmured, voice low. "What is it?" He looked up at Mitch, who now stood still, face unreadable but visibly irritated. "You got a problem with dogs?" Jacob asked calmly. "No," Mitch said, shaking his head. "But I don't like being barked at like I'm hiding a bomb." He gave a dry, uncomfortable chuckle. Jacob narrowed his eyes. "He usually only does that when something's wrong." "I fix machines, not people," Mitch snapped, then turned and walked quickly down the hall toward the supply room, his footsteps sharper than before. Sonny continued staring after him until he disappeared around the corner. Only then did the dog sit down, muscles still visibly tight beneath his fur. Hannah, who had emerged from Kyle's room, met Jacob's eyes. "That wasn't nothing," she said quietly. "No," Jacob replied. It wasn't. Later that day, Kyle dozed in and out of sleep. His dreams were jagged this time, flashes of broken staircases, dripping wires, and barking, always barking. When he woke, Hannah was at his side again, writing notes on his chart. "You ever have dreams you don't understand but still feel scared of?" he asked. She looked at him thoughtfully. "You're talking to someone who lost her husband in his sleep." "Yeah, dreams can whisper louder than facts." Kyle nodded, still hazy. "I keep hearing barking, not like Sonny yesterday, different, urgent, like I'm supposed to wake up to something." "You might be." Hannah tucked her pen behind her ear. "The body remembers things before the mind does. Sometimes it just takes a golden nudge to remind us." In the pediatric wing, Sonny later spent the afternoon comforting a little girl recovering from a spinal fusion, gently placing his head on her lap as she stroked his ears with small, careful hands. Jacob watched from the doorway, his mind still lingering on the moment in the ICU. Dogs didn't bark without reason, and Sonny. He only barked when lives were in the balance. Rain tapped gently against the high windows of St. Alora's Medical Center, turning the morning into a watercolor of muted gray and soft gold. The town of Fairhaven remained wrapped in a calm fog, but within the ICU wing, tension threaded through the sterile air like a fault line, waiting to split. Kyle Bennett sat propped upright in his hospital bed, jaw clenched as a physical therapist adjusted the angle of his legs. He was growing stronger, marginally, but the stiffness in his spine and the numbness in his lower limbs still held him hostage. Worse than the pain was the uncertainty. Every progress report came laced with a cautious maybe, and now, layered atop his physical recovery, something else had begun to take root, an unease that crept in with every flicker of shadow in his room. "Who's been in here lately?" Kyle asked aloud once the therapist left. "Other than Hannah and Jacob?" A pause. Then, as if summoned by thought, Hannah Collins stepped in, carrying a fresh IV line and a small tray of antiseptic swabs. She was her usual composed self, tall, lean, and composed with her hair in its habitual tight bun, but her eyes looked more tired than yesterday. A fine crease sat between her brows. "You worried someone's been snooping?" she asked lightly, setting the tray down. She moved toward his side to check the port in his arm, but froze when she saw something. "Kyle," she said, voice quieter now. "Did you scratch yourself?" He blinked. "What?" She lifted his arm gently to show him, a faint, linear red mark, barely scabbed over, trailing along his forearm. "It looks like a scratch or a light scrape. Do you remember doing this?" Kyle examined the mark, shaking his head. "No, I haven't moved enough to do that, unless I'm sleep fighting ghosts." Hannah cleaned it anyway, her fingers unusually careful. "Could be nothing. But I'll note it down." Outside the room, Sonny paced the hallway again, his nails clicking against the floor in steady rhythm. Jacob stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the dog with a wary eye. Sonny had never paced before, not like this. He paused, ears twitching, every time a door creaked or a cart rolled past. And each time Mitch Rourke appeared, sometimes with tools in hand, sometimes just passing through. Sonny's demeanor shifted sharply. Today was no different. Mitch came up the hallway, pushing a cart with several sealed medical boxes marked Monitoring Unit, Maintenance. His navy work shirt hung loose over his wiry frame, and he wore a gray beanie pulled low over thinning dark hair. He kept his gaze down, but Sonny saw him first and instantly stopped pacing. A growl, low and throaty, spilled from the dog's chest. Jacob narrowed his eyes. "Not again," he murmured. Mitch slowed, eyes flicking to the dog. "What's his problem this time?" he asked with forced amusement. "He doesn't have problems," Jacob said, his voice low and deliberate. "He has instincts." Mitch scoffed, then pushed the cart faster, disappearing into the nearby utility closet. That night, Jacob requested access to the ICU hallway camera logs. But when the night technician, Paula Grant, checked the system, a petite woman with short-cropped silver hair and a sharp analytical mind, she frowned. Paula was a by-the-book professional, always punctual and precise, known around the hospital as Clockwork Paula. She had a deep, methodical way of speaking and never raised her voice. A former air traffic controller, she had come to work in hospital security after a nervous breakdown grounded her career. "Everything is pattern," she often said. "When the pattern breaks, something's wrong." Now, the pattern had definitely broken. "There's a 3-hour block missing," Paula said, pointing to the logs on her monitor. From 3:11 a.m. to 6:08 a.m., the ICU corridor camera didn't record anything. Jacob frowned. "System failure?" "Doesn't match the diagnostics. It wasn't a crash. Someone paused the recording manually." She tapped her stylus. "And it happened during third shift, Mitch's shift." "Is that logged?" "Not directly," she said. "Maintenance staff aren't under continuous surveillance, but there's a door sensor on the ICU supply closet. It was opened at 3:23 a.m. and closed again at 3:41. Guess who has the access badge?" Jacob didn't respond. He just looked down at Sonny, who stood beside him in the small office, tail low, eyes alert. Back upstairs, Kyle tossed in his sleep, face tightening. He was dreaming again. Not of the gunfire and chaos from the drug bust that shattered his spine, but of cold hands and silent figures entering his room under flickering lights. The barking returned, then pain. Then nothing. He woke with a start, sweat cooling on his neck, and reached for the nurse call button. But Sonny had already entered with Jacob, having insisted at the door, his nose pressed and body tense until they let him in. The moment he saw Kyle, Sonny trotted to the side of the bed and let out a sharp, anxious whine. He placed a paw on the edge of the mattress and looked at Kyle with eyes too knowing for a dog. "Something's wrong," Kyle said hoarsely. "I don't know what, but something." Jacob didn't say anything. He just sat quietly in the chair beside the bed, one hand on Sonny's back. Outside the window, lightning flickered once through the mist, and the wind began to rise. The early afternoon sky over Fairhaven had darkened into the silver hue of a pending storm. Clouds crawled across the valley with brooding weight, and the scent of ozone lingered in the air like a breath held too long. Inside St. Elora's Medical Center, the atmosphere was no less tense-like. Something had shifted just enough to set everyone on edge without knowing why. Kyle Bennett sat in his bed, more alert than usual. His strength was slowly returning, and though the numbness below his waist persisted, today his mind felt sharp, wired. He had asked earlier to see Sonny again, not just for comfort, but because something deep inside told him the dog knew more than anyone was willing to admit. In the hallway outside room 214, footsteps echoed. Jacob Rivers was approaching, his gait steady despite the slight hitch in his right knee, a souvenir from a training accident years ago. He was dressed in his usual flannel shirt under a navy vest with the Healing Tales logo stitched in gold thread. Sonny walked beside him, leash slack, posture calm but alert, his golden fur seeming to glow faintly under the hospital's sterile lights. Just ahead of them, Mitch Rourke emerged from the ICU supply closet, clipboard in hand. His posture was slightly hunched today, jaw clenched tighter than usual. He passed room 212, then 213, and that's when it happened. Sonny stopped dead in his tracks, hackles bristling. His head turned sharply toward Mitch, and a low, guttural growl crawled out of his throat. growing into a bark, sharp, fierce, insistent. Jacob instinctively tightened his grip. "Sonny, no!" But the dog surged forward, barking louder now, pulling the leash with surprising force. Mitch flinched, taking an involuntary step back. His eyes widened, not in annoyance, but in something closer to panic. Nurses nearby halted mid-stride, unsure whether to intervene. A tray of bandages clattered to the floor. The corridor froze. Sonny placed himself directly between Mitch and Kyle's door, body rigid, tail out, teeth bared, not to attack, but to shield. "Jesus!" Mitch snapped, voice unsteady. "Get your mud under control." Jacob's eyes narrowed. He didn't move. He didn't speak at first. Then, slowly, he crouched beside Sonny, whispering close to the dog's ear. The barking didn't stop, but it lowered, softened into the low, warning rumble. "Something's not right," Jacob muttered. At that moment, Security Officer Janet Ruiz arrived mid-30s, Latina, strong build, with her jet-black hair braided into a single no-nonsense plait. Known for her calm presence and sharp instincts, she had worked hospital security for 6 years, and nothing startled her easily. She stepped between Jacob and Mitch, one hand raised. "What's going on here?" she asked. Jacob rose slowly. "Sonny's reacting again. Same man, same corridor, same intensity." Mitch let out a breath, tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Look, I've got work to do. This dog clearly doesn't like me. Maybe it's the smell of the epoxy I use. That's a thing, right?" Janet glanced between the two men. "For now, I'm going to ask you to step back from the ICU wing, Mr. Rourke, just until we figure out what's triggering him." Mitch's jaw twitched, but he nodded stiffly. "Sure, fine." He turned on his heel and disappeared around the corner. Sonny immediately relaxed, his tail lowering, ears swiveling back. Jacob didn't smile. Instead, he looked at Janet and said quietly, "That was the 3rd time, and Sonny doesn't guess." Later that evening, Jacob found Hannah in the break room, stirring a cup of tea with slow, thoughtful motions. She looked tired hair, slightly looser than usual, dark circles under her eyes that even the soft overhead lighting couldn't hide. She looked up as he entered, then offered a faint smile. "Rough day?" she asked. Jacob pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "I need to tell you something. About Sonny." She set her spoon down. "I'm listening." Jacob leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. "He's more than a therapy dog. I trained him myself, not just to comfort patients, but to sense them. He's flagged 3 cardiac arrests before they happened. Once, with a stroke patient, he laid down by the man's feet and refused to move. 10 minutes later, the man collapsed. Hannah's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "He reacts to something deeper. Scent, maybe. Heart rhythms. I don't know. But when he does that bark, the one he did today, it means he's trying to prevent something." Hannah sat in silence for a moment. Then quietly, "And Mitch?" Jacob shrugged. "I don't know. But I don't like how Sonny acts around him. It's more than discomfort. It's protection." Back in room 214, Kyle was sitting up straighter than usual, his body still but his eyes alert. When Sonny entered the room a few minutes later, his tail wagged slightly, and the stiffness in his shoulders melted away. Kyle smiled as the Golden patted over and rested his chin on the side of the bed. "Hey there," he said softly, stroking the dog's warm fur. "You've been busy today, huh?" Jacob stood by the door, watching silently as the two connected again. He caught Hannah's eye as she entered behind him. "He asked to see Sonny," she said. "Said he had questions." Kyle looked up at both of them. "I don't know what's going on," he said slowly. "But every time I sleep, I see shadows. I hear barking. And when I wake up, he's here, like he's pulling me back." No one spoke for a beat. Then Jacob stepped forward. "Sometimes, Kyle, the body hears danger before the brain can explain it. And sometimes, dogs like Sonny, they hear it even earlier." Kyle looked down at the dog resting by his hand. "Then I'm glad he's listening, because something's coming. I can feel it." Outside the hospital, thunder rumbled in the hills, and the rain returned in thin, deliberate lines, like warning drums echoing from the horizon. A cold brightness fell through the ICU windows at St. Alora's the next morning, the kind of sterile light that made even the air feel sharper. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained low and heavy, holding back the sun like a secret. Inside, Room 214. Kyle Bennett shifted under the covers, a grimace forming across his face. The dull ache in his back had grown sharper, pushing into his abdomen. It wasn't like the usual spasms from his spine. This was different, hotter, deeper, and spreading. He pressed the nurse call button, his fingers trembling slightly. The machine beeped once, and within minutes, Hannah Collins arrived, clipboard in hand, concern already written across her features. She paused in the doorway when she saw the color of his skin pale with a sheen of sweat, and the way he clutched his side. "Kyle," she said quickly, stepping closer. "What's going on?" He exhaled slowly, jaw tight. "My stomach. It hurts. Worse than before. Feels like something's wrong inside." Hannah placed a cool hand on his forehead and didn't like what she felt. "You're burning up," she muttered. She glanced over to the door, where Jacob stood with Sonny, having just arrived for their morning visit. Sonny had already walked in ahead, and now stood close to Kyle's bedside, his body tense, his tail low, a low growl escaping his throat. Just outside, a supply cart rolled by, pushed by none other than Mitch Rourke, dressed as usual in his maintenance blues and beanie, his eyes downcast. As he passed room 214, Sonny growled louder, stepping slightly forward, placing himself between Kyle and the hallway. Jacob narrowed his eyes. "That's the fourth time he's done that," he whispered to himself. Back at Kyle's side, Hannah was already making a call. "I need a CT scan on Bennett, stat," she said firmly into the receiver. "Abdominal, full contrast." Jacob looked at her, then down at the dog. "He knows," he said quietly. "Whatever it is, he knows." 20 minutes later, Kyle was wheeled down to radiology, still sweating, his breaths growing shallower. Sonny stayed behind with Jacob, pacing restlessly. Hannah watched the two through the glass as she returned from the imaging wing. Her heart pounded. She had seen infections before, internal bleeds, ruptures, but this felt deliberate. That thought wouldn't leave her, especially when she looked over the IV line still connected to Kyle's arm. It had been changed twice over the last few days. She checked the records. One line had been swapped during night shift 3 days ago, another one yesterday morning. Her fingers paused over the initials on the log. Mr. Mitch Rourke. Meanwhile, Detective Elijah Cortez had arrived at the hospital. Tall, wiry, and always impeccably dressed in slate gray suits with narrow ties, Elijah had the calm demeanor of a man who read people for a living. With olive skin and intelligent hazel eyes, he rarely spoke more than necessary. A decade ago, Kyle had worked briefly with him on a multi-state narcotics task force. Now, fate had brought him back. Elijah entered the admin wing, flashing his badge at the front desk. "Detective Cortez, Portland PD. I need access to employee files for Mitch Rourke. There's an active investigation tied to narcotics corruption and patient safety." The HR assistant, Sandra Blevins, looked up from her desk. A former social worker in her late 50s, Sandra had kind eyes and a strong sense of duty, but was often overworked and undersupported. She adjusted her glasses and typed quickly into her terminal. "He's been with us 4 years, mostly night shifts. No formal complaints, but hold on." She clicked through screens, brow furrowing. "There's a flag note from a hospital in Seattle. He worked there before left without notice after a theft investigation involving sedatives and lab supplies. Nothing conclusive, but it raised eyebrows." Elijah's expression darkened. "And we still hired him?" "He passed the background check," Sandra said softly. "But the system doesn't always catch everything." Back upstairs, Kyle had returned from the scan, barely conscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Hannah met the radiologist, Dr. Raj Patel, outside the imaging room. Raj was a soft-spoken man in his late 30s, with thick glasses and a quiet intensity. Known for his precision and lack of small talk, he held a tablet in his hand, frowning. "I don't like what I'm seeing," he said. "There's severe inflammation in the lower abdomen. And look here, trace chemical residues consistent with slow-acting toxins. Non-lethal dose, but cumulative." Hannah's throat tightened. "You're saying he was poisoned?" "More like tampered with, likely through IV fluids. Traces show up in his bloodstream over the last 72 hours. Small doses, consistent spacing. Someone knew what they were doing." She exhaled slowly. "It's him. It has to be." Later that evening, Elijah joined Hannah and Jacob in the staff lounge, where Sonny lay curled at their feet, ears twitching. Hannah filled him in on the timeline, the suspicious IV entries, and Sonny's repeated reactions to Mitch. Elijah opened a folder and pulled out a document. 2 years ago, Mitch Rourke's name appeared in an informant report tied to a small-time distribution network in Portland. Back then, it didn't go anywhere. But here's the twist. The leader of that group was the same man Kyle took down during the bust that broke his back. Jacob leaned forward. So, this is personal. Maybe, Elijah said. Or maybe it's part of something bigger. At that moment, a page came over the hospital's overhead speakers, calling for Dr. Patel and ICU staff to room 214. Hannah bolted up and rushed down the corridor. Sonny followed close behind, barking once sharp and high-pitched. Kyle had spiked a fever. His blood pressure was dropping. Emergency protocol was initiated, but it was no longer a mystery. It was a crime scene. The clock above the nurse's station glowed 2:14 a.m. in soft red digits. Most of St. Alora's medical center had gone still, save for the faint beeps of monitors and the hum of climate control whispering through the walls. Night had blanketed Fairhaven in a heavy silence, broken only by distant thunder muttering above the valley. Inside room 214, Kyle Bennett lay half awake, his body still weak but his mind unusually sharp. Hours earlier, the emergency team had stabilized him after the toxic findings. His fever was falling now, but the ache deep in his stomach hadn't fully gone. Sonny was curled at the foot of his bed, a warm, steady presence. His breathing was slow, but his ears twitched occasionally. Jacob had left around midnight after triple-checking the IVs and assuring Hannah he'd be back at sunrise. Across the hallway, Hannah sat at the monitoring desk just outside Kyle's room, flipping through Kyle's latest lab reports. Her fatigue pressed at the edges of her vision. But she wouldn't leave. Not tonight. Too much had happened. Too many unknowns remained. She took a slow sip of her lukewarm tea and adjusted her cardigan over her scrubs. The hallway lights dimmed slightly on schedule for night mode. All appeared calm, until Sonny rose. No bark, no growl. Just a sudden shift head up, ears pricked forward, body stiff. Hannah noticed immediately. "Sonny," she whispered, standing. The dog moved to the doorway, tail straight, staring down the hall. Hannah followed his gaze and saw a shadow move. At first, it was barely perceptible. A flicker. Then a figure emerged from behind the corner, walking with careful, silent steps. The man wore scrubs and a surgical mask, cap pulled low. He moved like someone used to being invisible. But Sonny didn't need a face to recognize him. He launched forward, barking violently, teeth bared. The sound split the hallway like a blade. The masked man stopped instantly, frozen mid-step, just outside Kyle's door. Sonny planted himself in front of the door, barking louder, the echo waking half the wing. Kyle jolted upright, heart hammering. Hannah, already moving, hit the code blue emergency button on the wall. Alarms erupted. Lights flared back to full brightness. The man turned to run, but two security guards, Officer Janet Ruiz and her colleague Miles Corwin, a tall, broad-shouldered ex-Marine with a shaved head and steady voice, rounded the corner and tackled him before he got more than a few steps. The bottle dropped from his hand and rolled across the tile. Hannah ran to it first, snatching it up. The label was scratched off, but she knew that smell. Her hands trembled. "It's the same compound, same scent." Janet yanked down the man's mask, and there he was, Mitch Rourke, pale, sweating, eyes wild with rage and desperation. "Get off me!" he snarled. "This isn't what it looks like." "You brought poison into a patient's room," Janet snapped, her knee on his back. "Tell me what it is now, or we'll let the FBI guess." Kyle, still stunned, watched the scene from his bed. Sonny hadn't moved from his place at the door, growling low and steady. Within 15 minutes, Elijah Cortez arrived, his tie slightly crooked and rain droplets clinging to his shoulders. He looked down at Mitch as they cuffed him to the gurney. "Guess you forgot your face was already familiar," he murmured. "What are you talking about?" Mitch growled. "You were seen." "By the right eyes," Elijah said, nodding toward Sonny. And apparently, that was enough. Mitch was escorted out under heavy watch. The remaining IV bags in Kyle's room were replaced and tested. Every piece of equipment was scanned and secured. By morning, Kyle was moved to a separate high-security room near the cardiac unit. New locks, new nurses. Sonny was assigned to stay with him indefinitely, with Jacob granted 24-hour access. In the cafeteria, a small crowd gathered around a table where Linda, a retired teacher recovering from a heart valve replacement, held court. Short, plump, and beloved for her sweet tooth and louder-than-average laugh, she had her knitting in one hand and her phone in the other. "You know that dog saved that young man's life, right?" she told another patient. "3 times, they say. 3, now that's a hero." Soon the story had traveled across every floor. A patient in oncology asked for a visit from the Golden Dog. A boy in pediatrics whispered Sonny's name when he couldn't sleep. A nurse left a paper bone on Sonny's bed that read, "Thank you." Kyle smiled when he heard it all. For once, the headlines were not about what had gone wrong, but about a dog who refused to stay silent. The late morning sun finally broke through the heavy clouds over Fairhaven, casting long golden bars across the tiled floors of St. Elora's upper wing. For the first time in days, light seemed to linger, warming windowsills, brightening faces, and breathing something like hope into the otherwise sterile hallways. Kyle Bennett sat in his new room on the 5th floor, one of the more secure sections of the hospital. His vitals had stabilized overnight. The poisoning had stopped, thanks to Sonny. And though he still felt a dull ache in his side, he was upright and alert, his voice no longer strained, his mind clear. The nurses said it was a miracle. Kyle called it a bark. Sonny lay beside his bed, eyes half-lidded, ears occasionally twitching. Every now and then, he'd glance up, as if checking whether Kyle was still breathing. Dr. Raj Patel stood by the window, flipping through a series of test results on his tablet. With his lab coat unbuttoned and glasses slipping down his nose, he looked both tired and deeply satisfied. "You're lucky," he said without looking up. "Another 6 hours with that toxin in your bloodstream, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "How bad would it have gotten?" "Septic shock, organ failure. You wouldn't have woken up today." Dr. Patel finally looked at him, his voice steady. "That dog barked before your vitals even registered anything wrong. If I didn't know better, I'd say he read your bloodstream." Kyle smiled and glanced at Sonny, who gave a soft wag of his tail in acknowledgement. The room door opened gently, and in walked Elijah Cortez, crisp as ever in a charcoal jacket and black slacks, though the rings under his eyes hinted he hadn't slept either. He gave Kyle a nod. "We confirmed it," he said, pulling a file from under his arm. "Mitch Rourke's real name is Martin Rourke, older brother of Jake Rourke, the man you brought down in that warehouse raid last year. He used a fake name to get hired here, but the facial recognition scan finally caught the match." Kyle leaned back in his bed, the realization sinking in. "So, this was revenge." Elijah nodded. "And long planned. He got a job here 6 months ago, transferred to night shifts, slowly learned the system. And when you arrived, he saw his chance." Kyle ran a hand down his face. "And Sonny saw through him from day one." Elijah smiled faintly. "We're opening a wider investigation into who might have helped him, but for now, you're safe." Later that afternoon, as the sun filtered warmly across the hospital lawn, Jacob Rivers arrived with a brown paper bag in hand and a slow, thoughtful smile on his face. Sonny perked up the moment he saw him and trotted to the door, tail wagging furiously. Jacob knelt beside him and rubbed behind his ears. "You've been stealing hearts again, huh?" Kyle chuckled softly. "He's more than earned it. Look, Jacob, I've been thinking." He sat up straighter, voice steady. "Once I'm discharged, I want to adopt Sonny, not just out of gratitude. I need him, and I think maybe he needs someone too." Jacob's smile faded into something gentler, more paternal. He sat in the chair beside the bed, resting the bag on his knee. "You're not the first to ask that." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "Oh? There's a boy," Jacob began. "His name's Alex. He's 10. Born with a congenital heart defect. Comes in every Tuesday for observation and weekly injections. His body's weak, but his spirit," Jacob smiled, "is a little wildfire." Jacob pulled out a crumpled drawing from the bag. It showed a clumsy but colorful picture of Sonny with a red superhero cape and a crown on his head. "That's how Alex sees him. The Golden King." Kyle studied the drawing in silence. Jacob continued. "Whenever Sonny visits him, the kid stops trembling. The nurses say it's the only time his blood pressure doesn't spike. I can't take that away from him. Not yet. Kyle exhaled slowly. I get it. Really, I do. But when the time's right, when Alex no longer needs him like that, maybe you'll let him come home with me. Jacob nodded, his voice low. If that time comes, and it's right, I'll bring him to your doorstep myself. In the pediatric wing that same afternoon, little Alex McKinley sat by the window with an IV drip in his arm. He had a mop of curly brown hair, bright eyes, and a Star Wars blanket wrapped tightly around him. When one of the nurses told him Sonny wouldn't be coming that day, he didn't cry. He just smiled softly and said, "That's okay. He's being a hero somewhere else. Heroes get busy." He pulled out another crayon and began drawing a new picture this time, of Sonny standing in front of a hospital door, barking at a shadowy figure. "He always knows," he whispered. The last days of spring had begun to stretch gently into summer. Fairhaven, now washed clean from weeks of rain, sparkled under a sky so blue it seemed painted. Inside St. Alora's Medical Center, light flooded through open windows and glinted off silver name tags, white tiles, and glass vases filled with fresh tulips, brought in that morning by volunteers. A rare kind of hush blanketed the lobby, not one of silence, but of reverence. A folding podium stood at the far end of the central atrium. Rows of chairs had been set up facing it, some filled with doctors in lab coats, others by nurses in navy scrubs, and still more by patients in wheelchairs and robes, IV poles trailing behind them like cautious shadows. A banner above read, "In gratitude, we gather." Kyle Bennett sat near the front. A pair of crutches leaned beside his seat. He wore a pressed blue shirt, slacks slightly too big now after his hospital stay, and a badge-shaped pin handed to him by hospital security just an hour ago. He looked stronger, his face regaining color, his posture more confident. But more than that, he looked centered, like someone who had walked through the fire and stepped out carrying the flames. Next to him sat Jacob Rivers, his arms folded, weathered face unreadable but calm, and stretched lazily on the floor before them. Sonny dozed, golden coat gleaming in the sunlight, unaware or perhaps humbly indifferent to the attention he had drawn from every corner of the building. Across the way, a small boy in a wheelchair waved. Alex, dressed in a red hoodie and holding a hand-drawn sign that read, "My hero has 4 legs," grinned as Sonny lifted his head and gave a quiet tail wag. The hospital administrator, Dr. Marlene Whitaker, stepped up to the microphone. A tall woman in her mid-60s with closely cropped silver hair and a commanding but kind presence, she had served as head of St. Alora's for almost a decade. With her sharp green eyes and elegant charcoal suit, she carried herself like someone who had fought many quiet battles. Budget cuts, policy changes, and personal loss, and emerged with grace intact. "We're here," she began, her voice clear but gentle, "not just to recognize one act of heroism, but to honor what courage looks like when it's silent, furry, and walks on 4 paws." There was a ripple of soft laughter. Some clapped. Dr. Whitaker continued. "Sonny's actions went beyond protocol, beyond instinct. He saved a man's life, not once, but several times. He reminded us that healing is not always administered through syringes and sutures, but sometimes through presence, through protection, through love." She stepped aside and gestured toward Kyle. A beat passed. Then Kyle rose slowly, gripping one crutch with his right hand, the other pressing against the chair. The crowd held its breath. He steadied himself, exhaled, and stepped toward the microphone. "Most people," he began, voice low, "don't expect to be saved by a dog." A few chuckles. Sonny blinked lazily from below. Kyle looked out across the crowd. "I've been a cop for nearly a decade. I've seen what danger looks like. I've walked into rooms where everything goes wrong in seconds. But when I came here, when I lay in that bed, I didn't know the fight wasn't over." He paused, eyes settling on Sonny. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him, not just because he barked, but because he never stopped watching. He knew what I didn't. He guarded me when I couldn't guard myself." He looked at the staff, and to every nurse, every tech, every person who stayed alert, who believed in a barking dog over a quiet lie, "Thank you." The room erupted into applause, long, heartfelt. Even the pediatric wing upstairs clapped along via a live video feed. As Kyle stepped back, Sonny stood and trotted beside him without command, tail brushing against Kyle's calf like a gentle reminder. "I've got you." After the ceremony, amid paper cups of lemonade and cookie trays, Jacob pulled Kyle aside near the courtyard fountain. The breeze tugged gently at their clothes as Alex wheeled past with his nurse, blowing a kiss toward Sonny, who barked once in response. Jacob waited until they were alone. "You meant what you said back there?" Kyle nodded. "Every word." Jacob reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather tag, a dog license. "Then he's yours," Jacob said. "Officially." Kyle stared. "You're sure?" Jacob shrugged. "I've seen dogs bond with people, but what you two have, that's more than training. That's destiny." "But what about the program?" Kyle asked. "And Alex?" Jacob smiled. "You're both part of it now. Deal is, you and Sonny show up once a month. Volunteer visits, especially on Tuesdays." Kyle laughed softly, emotions threading into his voice. "Deal." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the hospital lawn, Sonny lay in the grass between them, eyes half closed, ears twitching at the sound of children's laughter echoing down the hill. Not just a dog, not just a hero, but now a partner, a symbol, and a guardian in golden fur. Among the saved stood the one who had done the saving. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles wrapped in thunder or chariots of fire. Sometimes he sends them quietly, with soft golden fur, a gentle heart, and a bark that refuses to be ignored. Sonny didn't just guard a man's life, he reminded a whole hospital, a whole town, that healing doesn't always come in pills or machines. Sometimes it comes with a tail that wags when all seems lost, with eyes that watch over you even when you sleep, with love that chooses you again and again. Kyle found more than recovery. He found purpose. Jacob found legacy. Alex found courage. And through them all, Sonny walked brighter than any medal, louder than any applause. So maybe next time, when you pass by a quiet dog resting at someone's side, or see a soul clinging to hope in a hospital hallway, you'll remember this story. You'll remember that angels sometimes wear fur and bring healing not through sermons, but through presence. And maybe, just maybe, you'll believe that God still moves through pause. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to believe again. Leave a comment below. Tell us the name of the animal that once saved your life. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more true stories of love, courage, and redemption. May God bless you and every soul you've ever helped, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4.